Good morning, poetry fans. Nice to have you back for another session of poems. This is Jim Ransom, um, your inveterate poetry reader every Saturday. I always try it again. And you may remember that last week I mentioned former U.S. Poet Laureate Billy Collins has a new book out called Whale Day. And here it is. This is my copy of Whale Day. I'm not going to read the title poem Whale Day because I've found some others in here that I think might be more suitable. But first, let's have a word about Billy Collins. Maybe one reason I like him is that he is about my age and in some cases perhaps the age of some of you, which is getting up there and which is a theme of the first poem that I'll read. It's called Life Expectancy. On the morning of a birthday that ended in 0, I was looking out in the garden when it occurred to me that the robin on her worm hunt in the dewy grass had a good chance of outliving me, as did the worm itself, for that matter, if he managed to keep his worm head down. It was not always like this. For decades, I could assume that I would be around longer than the squirrel dashing up the tree, or the nightly raccoons in the garbage, longer than the barred owl on a branch, the ibis, the chicken, and the horse. Longer than 4 deer in a clearing and every creature in the zoo, except for the elephant and the tortoise, whose cages I would hurry past. It was just then in my calculations that the cat padded noiselessly into the room, and it seemed reasonable, given her bright eyes and glossy coat, to picture her at my funeral, dressed all in black as usual, which would nicely set off her red collar. Some of the mourners might pause in their grieving to notice as she found a place next to a labradoodle in a section of the church reserved for their kind. You'll notice the low-key trip to Fantasyland in which Billy Collins takes you at the end of the poem. I should add that this is not unusual for Billy Collins to talk about animals as much as he talks about humans. He was the only son of a New York businessman and a mother who gave up a career as a nurse to raise him. And she had the remarkable faculty of being able to quote many poems from memory. That would have been a wonderful benefit for almost any small child. So why wouldn't he become a poet? How could he help it? He grew up reading and also writing poems at an early age. He was educated at good schools. That was back when they still had them. I shouldn't have said that. And got an advanced degree at the University of California, Riverside campus. Thank God he escaped Berkeley. You can find an exhaustive biography of him in Wikipedia, of course, which is online. And in fact, that's the only place Wikipedia appears. In the past, he was featured on several episodes of Garrison Keillor's Prairie Home Companion, which is where I first heard of Billy Collins, actually. And he picked up quite a few followers then, including me. He has made more than a small fortune from poetry. More, I would say, which is nearly impossible in today's world. But he's had so many prizes with decent dollar amounts connected to them, and so many grants from major institutions. And when he has worked as a professor, I would imagine that he has been well paid for his efforts and much in demand. I actually took a course from him online, and it was very delightful. I learned a lot from him, but everybody's poetry is a little different from everyone else's. And I certainly hope that I'm not trying to mimic Billy Collins in my work. But he's got a poem that I think is worth hearing today. It's called A Terrible Beauty. You may remember the poem that's been widely quoted. In fact, I've used it as an epigram in one of my early poems. April is the cruelest month. It comes from T.S. Eliot. Well, Billy Collins is taking a slightly different view of that. This poem certainly exemplifies the way Collins takes a cliche and gives it a fresh look in the context of that most American institution, the beauty contest. So this is called A Terrible Beauty. If you happened to miss this year's Cruelest Month competition, it began with all 12 contestants taking the stage together in the order of the calendar year, each dressed in outfits that sang of their personalities. March windblown and wet with rain. October resplendent in red and orange. Many wondered why April, a perennial loser, would even bother to show up, always smiling, daffodils embroidered on her bodice. Some blamed it on a poem she'd read somewhere. Others followed her early elimination. August, with zinc slathered on her nose. December looking like the Mother of God. It must be said that no one was surprised when the tuxedoed man with the microphone finally announced this year's winner, the same as every year since its beginning. Even though she'd shivered during the swimsuit part and stumbled when asked how she planned to change the world, February was the obvious choice. I mean, the Super Bowl's over by then, and spring's a mile away. What could be crueler? As one guy put it. And that was about it, except for the coronation. There she stood, the only month on the stage, crying a few chilly tears, a thin smile frozen on her lips. Then she bent her knees a little so as to be less tall, and some official placed on her head her latest dripping silvery crown of ice. I think that's a marvelous look at both swimsuit contests, beauty contests, and the Cruelest Month contest, which has never been won by April in spite of T.S. Eliot's urging. This is according to Billy Collins. Let's see if we can find another poem. finally, here's the Symphony Orchestra of San Miguel de Allende. Some of you have probably been to San Miguel. I haven't, but I knew it was a favorite tourist destination, as it is about 6,000 feet altitude and warm in the winter and cool in the summer. So here's, and Billy Collins has obviously been there. So here's his take on San Miguel de Allende. The Symphony Orchestra of San Miguel de Allende is not made up of the usual instruments. Instead of brass, strings, and woodwinds, there are church bells, roosters, doves, and barking dogs, all of which predate the horn, the violin, and the oboe. Notably the rooster, who crowed even before the time of Christ. The orchestra plays all day and into the night. But the music is most alive in the early morning, when much of the audience is half asleep and not distracted by their jobs and the errands they will be later in the day. At first, as I listened from my canopied bed, it sounded like a jumble of noise until I imagined a gigantic score written centuries ago by Mozart of Mexico. The genius who decided those dogs should come in just after the 32 gongs of a solemn bell, who had the doves modulate into an adagio, and who added a rest here and there, where the rooster should pause, but not for long. Are we not seekers of order, I thought, as when we follow the lines in our palms or connect the dots of the stars to form a bear in the sky? So, before rising from our slumberous beds, why not listen a little longer to this composition for dogs, roosters, doves, and bells? The dogs are barking to be fed. The roosters are beckoning us to the hen house, where 3 eggs are still warm in the straw. But the doves are mourning our awful losses, and the bells are there to remind us of God. So that's the Symphony Orchestra of San Miguel de Allende. I think it's a good place to stop. San Miguel is about 6,000 feet altitude. It's warm in the winter and cool in the summer. So it can be loaded with tourists, especially when it's winter up here. So no wonder Billy made it there. Where else would you go if you are a wealthy poet? That's almost an oxymoron. I hope you enjoyed today's offerings. I enjoyed reading them. I have no idea what next week will bring, so tune in and find out. And I hope you've enjoyed again my granddaughter Andrea's beautiful painting of a rose behind me here. And this is probably the rose of San Miguel de Allende. I would not know. Goodbye and good luck in the coming week.